So when beginning after creating your new file, the first thing you should always do is what? Save. So we should always save. Because if you save the file that you're working on, when it corrupts, not if, but when it corrupts, as a number of people have discovered that Flash has this uncanny ability to corrupt and trash your file, save your copy of your file in multiple locations. Don't just rely on it being on a flash drive, because flash drives fall out of your pocket, get lost in parking lots, go through the washing machine, or just decide to flake out over time. And that's just how it works. Okay, so now that we've got that business out of the way, I've created a file, I've saved a file. If I wanted to change the dimensions of my file, I would do it in the Properties panel over here on the right side of the screen, and I would hit Edit, and I could enter in a new height and width. I could also choose a default background color if I wanted to change that. My recommendation is that you don't rely on this background color as the color for your project, but instead you make any artwork that you want to be your background color. I enjoy starting with my document as not being white, because I find the white is just too bright to look at while I'm on screen, so I prefer to use a dark gray as my default background color. So now when constructing artwork that you're going to work with, so now that the stage has been sized to 711 by 400 or 16 by 9 proportion, I think it is a little bit more attractive to look at. Now when you're constructing your artwork, it generally works best to start and think about things being all the way back and then moving towards things that would be closer in the foreground. So if you think in terms of landscape, in a landscape you'll have mountains off in the distance, then you'll have houses or buildings in the midground, maybe a road, and then some trees, some bushes, and those things will be closer, and then we can make our characters move within that theatrical space that we'll be creating. So to start out with on this, and this ends up giving you a bunch of layers when you're all done, because you put everything on its own layers so that we can, one, find it, and two, that it's easier to animate when it's all contained on one layer. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just put a sky in the background. So I'll just choose a nice blue color, choose my rectangle tool, and I am going to put in a sky. So now I have a sky. Now if you notice, I can't see the edges or shape of my main stage area. It has been covered up by the sky, and that's okay. And I'll show you why in a moment. So if I have my sky here, now I'm going to designate my basic ground, the main kind of floor that everything is going to take place on. So I'm just going to choose a kind of a neutral color, and that's a little darker than I want. And if you notice, I haven't paid too close of attention to where those edges of that stage were. So now this layer that I've created here, if I double click on the layer name, I can give it a new name. So if I want to give that layer a name, and I'm just going to call mine sky ground to indicate what those two objects are. Now at this point it becomes much harder to figure out where is my stage, where am I going to be looking or working on putting things on screen. At that point, what's really nice is to add a new layer, use the rectangle tool, and we're doing this on a new layer because we'll treat this layer with and give it special properties in just a moment. So on this new layer, I am going to draw a rectangle. Now the rectangle that I drew, if we look here, is not going to be exactly what I want, because I want this rectangle to have a stroke attached to it, and my rectangle is being a little bit difficult at getting a stroke. So I'm going to pause. So what's really important is this next layer, this layer 2, this is going to be our stage guide. This is going to show us the frame of where the action is going to take place, because when we start animating, we need to know what is the left, the right, the top, the bottom. We need to know where that is so we know what's on screen and what's not. So I've added a new layer. My rectangle tool is now behaving properly. I don't know why it was choosing not to before. And what I'm going to do is change my stroke color to a bright red, and I'm going to give myself a fill color of empty. I don't want a fill color. Now if I draw a rectangle, and I'm not going to concern myself overly with how big it was, I'm going to draw it and then switch to the select tool, double click with the select tool so it highlights the rectangle. So now the rectangle has been highlighted, and I am going to set my X at 0, my Y at 0, and I will set my width to the size of my stage, and since I modified it to be 16 by 9, it's 711, and my height for my stage is going to be 400. Now you will want to enter numbers that correspond with yours. So when I look at this, I now see I have a red frame showing me where the edges of my stage are. So if I click off, I can see now there is this beautiful frame, and it will be a guide. Because it's a guide, I can now, in the Layers palette, I can name this Stage Guide. I can also change its properties, because if I leave that frame on there and save my movie, if I preview what it looks like, I will see that I get this kind of 1 pixel red line showing up on my movie, and I don't want that. Now if I make this bigger, we can see, there it is, there's that line, and yeah, I really don't want that red line to show up in the finished movie. I just want it to be a guide. Well, Flash gives us an option to turn layers into guides, so if I double click on the little icon next to the layer name or right click on it, I can now choose guide. And when I choose guide, that means now when I run my movie or publish my movie, that doesn't show up in the finished artwork. And that's how I want it to be. I want that guide to be there for me so that I can work. Now, what's really important at this point is to take this guide layer and click the lock icon in the layer palette, because that will prevent it from getting artwork added to it accidentally. And I realize I need to change my name. It's not my Layers palette, it's my Timeline palette, or Timeline window. But because we put layers into it and all the other applications refer to it as your Layers palette, I often will refer to that. But down here in the timeline where we see our layers, I've now double clicked on the icon next to the layer name to change it from a normal layer to a guide layer. And we can see that its icon changes to have a little T-square icon next to it, indicating it is a guide layer.